So what I will do now is we're going to go back to the question of whether something like the SMART campaign or client protection, to what extent that can help solve some of the problems or avoid some of the crises, and as well as what other kinds of mechanisms and actions can help prevent these kinds of crises from happening here in the Philippines. So I don't have the presentation in front of me, so I'm going to have to come around here so I can see it too. Why, just to review quickly, some of the reasons, the deep causes for the crisis in India has to do with the way the relationship that was taking place between the regulators and the industry. And the microfinance industry was really growing up as the orphan children and not as a welcome part of the industry, and was essentially not being well regulated by the MFI, who was preferring by the RBI, who was preferring somebody else. You add a history of political interference, the two models that were rivaling each other. One very important thing that I haven't mentioned before, but which I understand is quite relevant for us here to talk about, is the lack of credit bureaus in India. There was no credit bureau or information sharing about bad debtors at all. And finally, the mono product, which really drove people drove the providers to essentially force credit on people, since that was the only product they had to offer. So if you look at those as kind of the background, but then you have what led up to the crisis more immediately. Just the rapid growth, and I think the growth rates that Ron showed are not the kind of growth rates that lead to this kind of a crisis. They're more moderate growth rates. The growth rates that he's showing are more sustainable, but there may still be an issue of a maximum that is a crisis signal. I have just been talking with Adrian Gonzalez, who's an analyst at the Mix. And he's been looking at over-indebtedness and crisis data from around the world, and he seems to think that any time that you get a situation in which more than the number of microfinance borrowers exceeds 10% of the population, that you're going to have a problem. And I see that the percentage in the Philippines is definitely not at 10% yet. But that he's sort of coming up with the conclusion that this is a key warning factor. And so, looking and seeing whether any of these kinds of practices are the kinds of practices that are going on here, location of branches, multiple branches in the same locations, harsh collection practices, the press beginning to turn against microfinance, and I think very importantly, what's the strength of the associations? In India, there was one association that was relatively passive. When the crisis happened in 2006, a second association came up, but it was again also somewhat weak and was unable to really change practices in the industry. So is the industry really supporting the associations, and are the associations really connecting well with the regulators? So looking at Bolivia, we looked at the crisis in Bolivia and a little bit about why it happened. But what we didn't talk about was what happened in Bolivia afterwards. So a big thing is that the Bolivian microfinance industry made a giant shift away from group lending towards individual lending. Now, in the case of Banco Sol, it almost completely abandoned group lending, and has now, whereas it used to be almost 100% group, it's now 97% or something like that individual. And so there are still group lenders in Bolivia, but the dominant force in the in the sector is now individual, and I think that part of that is because of the fact that that in a crisis, the groups unraveled faster because they infect each other, or that all the group members infect each other when a critical mass of people start to go down. But it's also because the individual lending allows for the methodologies tend to emphasize repayment capacity analysis in a way that the group lending methodologies don't. And that is the second bullet there. Underwriting standards were tightened. So when you look at methodologies for underwriting microfinance loans, they were created at a period in which there was no such thing as competition. And so you make assumptions that if you look at the client's ability to repay, you don't have to worry much about the fact that they might have other debt from somewhere else. And as that assumption becomes less and less true because there is more competition and people do have more access, the lending methodologies need to change. They need to look at some of those kinds of ratios that Ron was showing about debt to income ratios, and they need to begin collecting more information about the existing indebtedness of other clients and coming up with new rules about how much indebtedness is acceptable. And that has been enhanced in Bolivia by the fact that the credit bureau was greatly strengthened after the crisis. Now, the Bolivian credit bureaus, what had been happening at the time of the crisis is that there was a sort of an informal credit bureau that had been developed by the MFIs that were nonprofit organizations, and then there was the central bank credit bureau, and so you could look at both of them, but the data wasn't all that great. And since then it has been really ramped up, and we're talking now about credit bureaus in Bolivia where you know how when your cell phone, when you get a text message, your cell phone goes bloop bloop? Well, in Bolivia, somebody's cell phone goes bloop bloop whenever a client, if you're in Banco Sol and a client of yours goes to FIE and tries to get a loan, you'll get a little blip blip there in Banco Sol that'll tell you, guess what? Your client just tried to get a loan from another institution. So that's how up to date the institution is. I mean, the credit bureau information is. It is not just negative screen, it's positive screen. It's kept up to date, and it's available immediately to everybody in the industry. So. Other things that happen, the codes of conduct are much, much more strongly enforced both by the associations and within each institution. And the associations have taken on a very important role in dialogue with regulators. And, I think the interesting thing is that in Bolivia, part of this whole turmoil that happened at that time was also part of a bigger political process of political change in Bolivia that led to the overthrow of the government and the putting in of Evo Morales, who is really a populist populist president. And so having a populist president like in the mold of Hugo Chavez of Venezuela or someone like that, it's a very challenging thing for most microfinance institutions or industries. But in the case of Bolivia, the associations in the industry were so together that they've even been able to establish a strong positive dialogue with the Evo Morales administration. So let's, with some of that as responses to the crisis, let's look at what's going on here. So first is diagnosis. What are the vulnerabilities of the Philippine sector? And I'm definitely only learning about it bit by bit, but this is what you people have been telling me as I've been preparing for this day. people are telling me that the lack of a strong credit bureau is one of the biggest vulnerabilities. That there's not enough scrutiny of repayment capacity, particularly among group lenders, and very little attention to how to treat multiple indebtedness in underwriting. That the pricing policies, as I think Ron described, are not particularly transparent. That there are some importation of South Asian harsh collection practices straight into Philippines lending methodologies, such as the practice of sit-down collections when people are not allowed to leave until all of the loans are repaid. And the last one being the legacy, the legacy of legacy, being that knowledge that the population is vulnerable, as is true in almost every country of the world, to schemers and people who misrepresent themselves as honest and who really aren't. But before we move to the assets, let me just ask if there are there other vulnerabilities that need to be on the table here as things to notice.
Anybody?
Ron.
I think the political angle is always there.
Yeah.
In terms of legislators taking up the cudgels and then
Legislators wanted to take advantage of or use microfinance in order to enhance their popularity.
More in the area of interest rate caps. And
Interest rate caps.
I think that keeps on resurrecting itself.
Okay. So political involvement with the sector, particularly in the area of interest rate caps. Anything else? Yes.
Not only just the political interest here, but I think some of them are involved in microlending too.
Yes, okay. Have they had their own
Little projects, either personally or as part of their office. And when they start feeling competitive pressure from the private sector, the NGOs, or the rural banks, then they're going to take strategic action.
Okay, one more.
I think the Microfinance Council has code of ethics, but there's no merit or demerit in the
A lack of enforcement ability related to, yes. Okay, great. We can come back to these. Let's look at some of the positive things that the sector has going. There's a sensible regulatory environment. As I think we are witnessing today and tomorrow, there's a lot of stakeholder cooperation. The regulators have been very much supportive of development of the industry, as opposed to sort of somehow treating it as not quite sure whether they like it. There are strong industry associations. Growth rates are reasonable. And the sector is able to offer a broader range of products. Particularly important, I think, is savings, because to me, I think one of the causes of the India problem is the fact that clients are not being offered a set of products that enables them to balance their financial management, but are only being offered the credit side. And I see here that there are more institutions that are able to offer both savings services and credit services. Anything else that is an asset of the Philippine sector? I mean, maybe don't be shy. Brag.
USA.
USA, okay, what else?
I think people here don't commit suicide when they get too indebted.
That's great. Good. Okay, let's.
I like to add another one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's like there are also a lot of sources of income for many households. For example, remittances, backyard farming, and their children go to work in companies. So there is an ability to generate sufficient cash flow by families.
That's good, and I think that you're actually hinting on something that has been a weakness in India, where I think the risk diversification of the family income is less. And in fact, many of the clients of microfinance in India really don't have micro enterprises at all. So let me just carry on to the next. So what I've been working on for the past 2 years really strongly is the development of the SMART campaign. And I know that you all know a lot about the SMART campaign because you've participated in the sector as a whole has participated with the SMART campaign in a couple of different ways. But the idea is really, how do you get the whole industry to be strongly client protective? And I think of it as part of the DNA of the industry should be client protection. And so the SMART campaign is really an industry development effort as opposed to a regulatory effort. It's not anti-regulation per se, but the whole purpose of the SMART campaign is the industry get itself to where it wants to be. And we're very excited with the SMART campaign that we've seen a lot of response from the industry. We now have almost 1,800 endorsers from 120 countries, including more than 500 MFIs. And so the first step that we like to ask people for is endorse the campaign, and that helps us be connected with you. But so what that means is really developing the standards, practices, and even certification that's necessary to have the whole industry agreeing on what good client protection practices actually are, and to back that up with a solid sort of governance for the campaign that can help keep it connected with the industry as a whole. So, as you know, the SMART campaign is founded on 6 client protection principles, and the industry. The campaign is about applying those principles into the practices of the industry. What I wanted to make I'm sure that you've all seen these 6, and many of you maybe have committed them to memory. But at any rate, they're going to change, and they're going to change in June at the next SMART Campaign Steering Committee meeting. And the reason for the change is because they're very credit-focused, as they are, and we're moving them into being something that can really last for a long time because they encompass the whole range of financial products. So the change won't be very great, but that'll be the nature of the change. But I think before moving away from the principles, as we're looking at the discussion that we've had up to this point, you see that the problems that have been described are the same problems that are being addressed by the campaign, particularly with respect to avoidance of over-indebtedness and transparency in collections. So, I'm here in part because I want to say we'd like to have the SMART campaign would like to assist the national. We believe that client protection is a national level issue, and as an international or global movement, we'd like to be able to support national movements to improve the client protection practices. So. We're looking at ways to help the industry support crisis avoidance, and some of the things that we would like to be able to do are to move from an awareness building towards a more implementation focus, but also in terms of communicating to the public, because a lot of the issues that we're seeing are this issue of the interface between the public perception of microfinance and what's going on inside the industry. So we feel that the campaign is also partly oriented towards helping to improve the public image of the industry. So I'll come back to this and your ideas, but I'm feeling like I probably need to carry on. I won't pause for your ideas right this minute. So just to be more specific about some of the things that can happen, and we've been focusing, the first year we really focused on getting the word out and making sure people knew about the principles, endorsed the principles, and sort of building the consensus. Because when we first started out, people were saying within the industry, oh, we don't have a problem, we're good. We don't do anything bad. And so we don't need client protection. But the more we've, the events of the last 2 years, and the more that we dig into practices, and the more that people confront the public perception issues, the more it's clear that client protection needs to be at the top of the agenda. And in order to help institutions really apply the practices, we've been developing a wide array of research tools and resources. You can go to the Smart Campaign website and you can find them. But some of them, for example, the Operations Series, it's client protection in the individual lending process, client protection in the savings process. It's really walks you through the processes, the operational processes, and says, at this point you need to be thinking about this principle and doing this thing. At this point you need to be thinking about this and doing this. And so really very, very operationally oriented. Another series of tools that we have has to do with assessments of institutions, and I know that you're carrying out MCPI is carrying out assessments here now, has already done 6, and that's great. I wanted to refer to a new document that's out, guidance document. It goes really in depth into what do we really mean by these principles, and it's out for public comment now. And so please go to the Smart Campaign website and take a look at it. And we want to gather the responses from the industry, so we're looking for public comment. And then the main two things, the main real action items are partnerships with associations, and we have been working with both MCPI and RBAP, and to some degree, and like to continue to do that, to assist them in training members, training staffs of MFIs, and doing assessments. And ultimately, this year, we're really working on development of a certification process so that we will be able to have a Smart Campaign stamp of approval that we can give to organizations that meet this and really do a good job of applying the principles. So here's some ideas about what financial institutions can do. Really like to ask you all to endorse the campaign. If you do endorse the campaign, then you get on the list, and we can continue to communicate. We communicate once every 2 weeks with all the endorsers to bring people up to date with what is happening and what's available from the campaign. Every MFI, we want them to adopt the principles and make them their own. To do a self-assessment, which is something you do with the Getting Started questionnaire, and using that self-assessment to figure out what new actions are needed. When certification becomes available, I hope that there will be institutions in the Philippines that want to come forward and get that certification. And I think then it's also very important as to do the kinds of things that are happening here, which is for the industry to come together to promote client protection in the marketplace, because some of the things that are important client protection issues are difficult for one MFI to do because they seem to be at a disadvantage. And the discussion that Ron just had about interest rates and how they're communicated is the case in point. It's very difficult for one MFI to be transparent when the other MFIs are not being transparent. So that requires collective action. So who is taking the leadership here in the Philippines to make that collective action happen? And that goes for development of credit bureaus as well. And certainly, finally, the last thing that I wanted to mention is just the amount of staff training, because one of the things that we see with client protection is that institutions can have good policies and everyone has good intentions at the top, but if you look at what's actually happening at the field level, it's the frontline staff that goes between the clients and the staff. That's where client protection actually happens, and so staff training is absolutely crucial. Coming to associations and getting more specific about what you can do with associations. In addition to the things that I've already described, I think the dialogue with regulators is very, very important, as well as beginning to take on the task of client education. And we've already mentioned, I think, the other things, which are credit bureaus and the support for the certification process. So these are some of the things that are available. The SMART campaign will support and assist as to whatever degree we possibly can your efforts to do these kinds of things. So I'd like your viewpoints on what other ideas you have, and I guess we're going to move into a panel discussion. So I hope that this comes out of what other ideas do you have for how the SMART campaign can assist, but also the question, if we do all those things, will it work? Will it prevent the crisis? And I think it's a very relevant question. And my own answer is, I mentioned the 4 vulnerabilities that are always present. I don't think anything will make those 4 vulnerabilities go away, but I do think they're manageable through actions such as these.